Welcome everybody to the event on Woodhead Lead Mines. I know all of you are super excited to be here. I can't wait to hear all about it. I'm going to crack on really quickly because we've all been waiting so long, but just to say that this is a Galloway Glens project, and a Can You Dig It is our community archaeology programme. Galloway Glens is running for another 2.5 years, and the community archaeology project Can You Dig It is been joint funded by the National Lottery Fund and Historic Environment Scotland, so we're very grateful to them for their support of this. It's allowing us to put on these fortnightly events with a range of fantastic speakers. Anna's long been interested in history. When she was a child, she lived not far from lead mines that had been long worked out, but had tantalising ruins. And then when Anna came to Carsphairn 45 years ago, she found one that was in walking distance. I should say, actually, for our overseas video visitors, just to place us, we're in southwest Scotland, just in Dumfries and Galloway, in between sort of Dumfries and Stranraer, so quite a rural location. And you can find Carsphairn on the map. It's quite a remote rural settlement. So Anna lived there 45 years ago and found a lead mine within walking distance. She's since spent many years trying to find out everything she can about Woodhead Lead Mine, and I know that Anna's particularly interested in the population and the social history of it. Anna was a founder member of the Carsphairn Heritage Group, and with others learnt a huge amount about the history of the area. And actually one of the Galloway Glens projects recently has been to digitise the Carsphairn Heritage Group archive, and that's a fantastic resource for anyone who's interested in that area. Really good, can highly recommend that. Just Google Carsphairn Heritage Archive. She's been very interested in the local schools, family history, and in ruins, monuments and memorials of the area. What Anna didn't say in the introduction that she sent me was that she was a stalwart of the Stewartry community for many years and has served in many voluntary roles in support of the communities. So thanks for that, Anna, and for doing this today. We've also got John. Can you give us a wave, John? John was the curator at Stranraer Museum, and he's long been interested in mining history and the archaeology of mining and quarrying. In 2004, he was involved with the Galloway Metal Mines project, a Historic Environment Scotland funded project to record and interpret a representative sample of local mines, including the Woodhead Lead Mine. John's been working recently with the Coniston Copper Project, a community archaeology programme surveying copper mines in the English Lake District. Fascinating. I'll hand over now to Anna and John.
Good evening, everybody. It's been a great pleasure to sit here and watch where the participants come from, especially seeing so many from overseas. But it's great to see that there's such an interest in these lead mines. Now, this is very useful because it's a map showing where Carsphairn and the Woodhead lead mines are. For those of you who are familiar with the area, you'll know that this is a fairly remote part of southwest Scotland. But for those of you who live abroad, to give it some context, we're 60 miles south of Glasgow and 25 miles away from Ayr to the west and Castle Douglas 25 miles to the east. The other thing I'd like to point out, looking at this map, there's plenty of contour lines on it, which means it's a hill area, which we'll see when we move in towards the slides. And for those of you who are interested in the height, it's between 250 meters and 300 meters. And for those of you who prefer to see it in feet, it's between 750 and 1,000 feet, which does have a bearing on what we will see later in the slides and my talk and in John's talk. So we're going to whiz through some pictures now of the lead mine, just as they are now, just to let you know what you would see if you were going to go up there now. This is on the main entry into the lead mines, and you can see it's sat in a bowl of hillside of the top of the Kells Range. On the right-hand side is the chimney. In fact, there are two chimneys there. You can't really see the one that's really fallen down, but they're the only examples of lead mining chimneys in the whole of Scotland. And if you could have the next slide, Claire, which is slightly at a different angle towards the left, you see the central workings there. You can see some cottages on the left-hand side, and we'll be just mentioning those cottages later on. There were 5 houses there at one time, and at one time 35 people just lived in that row of houses. You can see the central working there and up towards the top of the mines. This is a central working here. This is where the industrial complex was, and we're looking up towards the chimney. The chimney is very isolated on the hillside, but it was well placed there because the prevailing wind comes from on the left of your picture, and therefore would blow the poisonous fumes away from the population living there. And on the way up to the chimney, you can see also a track, and we'll come back to that later, because that is where the flues were from the smelter works and the refining works that you can see here at the bottom. We're looking up towards the top of the lead mines here, with in front a shaft, an air shaft, and the facade on the left-hand side is the school with 2 rows of houses above, and some rather nice sycamore trees at the very top, which would be planted at the time when the lead mines were in being, because there are no other big trees in the area at all. This is me trudging up to the most spectacular air shaft there. There were about 7 air shafts, all down to the various levels of the mine. And the next slide will show you the Rowan trees, which are in this air shaft. I like to think that these are seeded from the original trees that were planted there, probably by the lead miners. Lead miners were particularly superstitious because they felt that the Rowan tree or the mountain ash would be ward off any evil spirits that they may find in the ground below. Here again, the one tall remaining chimney of its kind in Scotland. And I would just point out the beautiful dress stone of this chimney, which of course is one dress stone all over the buildings there. And again, one of the mysteries of the lead mines is, where did all the stone come from and who did all the dressing of it? It's just one of those things that we don't know very much about, because we don't know of any quarries in the area. These are part of the flues that come up from the industrial section at the bottom here. We're looking at the refining house, and to the right is the washing flooring, and immediately on the far side of the road is the smelter. And from these, there was a very intricate system of flues that went up to the chimney to take away the poisonous fumes. And this particular photograph here, it's really, can you imagine what a station like Clapham Junction would look like? It would be quite intricate in that you'd have rails running into rails, and this is what they can do here. They can shut off various flues to allow other flues to be opened and the smoke and the poisonous fumes to get straight up to the chimneys. Here you can see there's a double flue here going up to the chimney that's fallen down. It's interesting to see because it's a double flue, and you can see there's some very big stones there, which would have been the original slabs that would be put inside down across the flue. Again, the flue going up to the tall chimney. I have heard a story that small boys were sent up these flues to clean them off, to get the lead off the inside of these flues, so it would be very pure. I have no evidence at all of that happening in this area. That is the remains of the magazine, where they kept all the gunpowder and the dynamite, whatever they used to blow up the rock. Great decay over the years. The picture behind me is that dynamite house with a lintel over the doorway, taken about 25 years ago. So there has been quite a lot of deterioration there in this time. This slide shows some of the rows of houses. This one we're particularly looking at, the frontier, is called High Row. There were 10 houses here. The next one down is called Low Row. Altogether, in these 2 rows of houses, there are about 130 people living, and there was the school below that. Just to the right of this High Row here is a well, which is hidden in the grass at the moment. But that well was a story about that well came to me from an old lady in the 1920s. She was 80 when she corresponded with me, and she told me that when she was living at the mines there in the 1920s, her husband had gone down to Curl at Castle Douglas, and she was left on a very wild night with her children in one of the houses in this row. By the 1920s, there were only about 2 families living up here. So she instructed her children not to come out, and she was going to the well for water. Unfortunately, she fell in the well. Nobody could hear her. Children were told not to come out. It was such a wild night. It was just dreadful. She managed to pull herself out in the end and to get back, and it was one of her everlasting memories of life up at the lead mines. This is the building at the top of the lead mines. It's called Office Row. It was where the manager of the mines lived, where there was a shop, and just beyond it was a stable. And it looked down on a very nice garden where the sycamore trees, which I mentioned earlier, were. And it really, the manager who lived here for about 30 years could look down and survey everything that was going on at the mine. And this is the same building, taken in the 1950s. You can see how there's been a lot of decay there over the years. But although this was taken in the 1950s, I do have a record of somebody living there at that time, which must probably be slightly inaccurate, because I don't think the roof would be taken off when they were actually living there. And this at the bottom shows the smelters' houses. It also shows you one of the entrances, which is just upstream from that water coming down. And the other interesting thing that there is above that hole in the bracken, you can see a line running from left to right. And that was a line of one of the old lathes that brought water down to power all the machinery. They're quite easy to see, and I think we'll be talking about them later as well. That is the rather splendid facade of the school. When it finished being a school in about the 1850s, it became a shooting lodge for the Cathcart family who owned the lead mines. And it was only really a school for about 15 years, maybe less than that, but it was a school with a great reputation, and I'll come back to it later on. That's the inside of the school. Difficult to know when that was taken, maybe late 1880s, very high ceiling, probably quite comfortable inside. I wouldn't think it'd be terribly warm, although it was thick walled. It was pretty exposed living up there. That is a picture of the church that was built by the lead miners called Lamloch. It was a free church. They raised the money to build it, and it was outside the perimeter of the land owned by the owner of the lead mine, but it was only a church for about 25 years. And now we move back into what the lead mine looked like during production. This was probably taken in the 1880s. That would be 7 or 8 years after the final lead bar was made here. So it is beyond its best at that time. In fact, the buildings, they're looking as though the slates are coming off the roof of the washing house, washing flooring. Behind, you can see the vast amount of spoil which was taken away in the 1960s for building of the local roads. Behind the spoil is the school and the 2 rows of houses, with the top row still up there. And this is probably taken, I'm guessing, about the 1920s. You can see there's not much activity up there. The mining has long since stopped, but the central area of where the workings were is still there. The houses are still intact, and at that time there were 1 or 2 people still living there. So if you can remember, or try to remember these two images of what life was like at the time of the lead mines. If you can manage that, that's pretty helpful, because it'll come alive. What I'm going to say, it will come alive to you. The landlord at the Woodhead Lead Mine was a man called Colonel MacAdam Cathcart, who had married Jean MacAdam, who was the heiress of the Creighton-Gillen estate, or in nearby Darmelington. In 1838, the tenant noticed huge amounts of lead near the surface, and this started MacAdam's very ambitious project. Within months, shafts were sunk, houses were built, and 60 men were employed. And I do wonder, why on earth did he do it? He may have seen an opportunity because the lead mining industry was slowly recovering after the Napoleonic Wars, and coupled with the proximity of the port in Ayr and the nearby coal mines in Darmelington, Colonel Cathcart may have thought that his speculation would lead to accumulation. But alas, this wasn't to be. He died in 1865 in Leamington Spa, knowing that his vast investment at Woodhead had been a financial disaster. However, in the early years, he took a very active part in the planning of the mine. From 1838 onwards, he got built many buildings associated with lead processing, the chimneys, the 50 houses, a school, and the local minister in the village of Carsphairn commented that Colonel Cathcart kept control of the mine and personally supervised it. Many of the lead miners came from Wanlock Head and Lead Hills, areas in North Derbyshire, and I had noticed in the chat beforehand that there was one lady who said that her ancestors came from there, and I believe I've corresponded with her over the years. None of the village people had the skills that the lead miners from Wanlock Head and Lead Hills had. And there was a feeling that the lead miners who came to Woodhead regarded themselves as rather superior to the local people. These lead miners brought their families to live in the sturdy, well-built new houses built on the barren hillside. And by the 1841 census, there were 22 houses there with a population of 200. By 1851, just 10 years later, there were 50 houses with a population of 301. The miners who were the smelters lived in the row of houses at the bottom, but in the other house rows, there didn't seem to be any division of labor. Miners lived next door to laborers, and they all got on there together. There were some rows were named after miners. There was one called Weir's Row, there was one called Bones Row. Now, lead was mined at Woodhead from 1839 to 1873. The most active years were from 1840 to 1853. But in 1853, there was a slump in the price of lead. Then many miners left Woodhead. Some went to the mines of Darmelington, the coal mines there. Some went to the United States, particularly to Pennsylvania, to the coal mining areas there. And there were others who went to the gold fields of Australia. In the later censuses, some miners came from Cornwall, some from Wales, and some from Strontium in Argyll, but they didn't actually stay very long at all. There were miners, and there were smelters, labourers, lead washers, and obviously the wives and families. You might like to read an account of a man going down a lead mine, not the one at Woodhead, but one down at Black Craig. And he went down in 1872 or 73. His name was Alexander Trotter, and he wrote very graphically about his trip down to the bottom of a lead mine there. And although it was 30 years after the one at Carsphairn, probably was a very similar experience. It talked of men going over perilous ladders, going down to various levels, walking along rough-hewn corridors, passages that they had made themselves, walking all the way to the bottom of the mine. We do know that the miners at Carsphairn, the only light that they had, and we know this from one record that I've seen, they used an immense number of candles because that was the only light that they had, the spluttering light of a candle in this absolute darkness. Children were usually the lead washers. In the 1841 census, of the 23 recorded as being lead washers, 12 of them were aged 14 and under, and 6 of them were aged 10 and under. In about 1843, the smelters earned about 18 shillings a week with free housing and free coal. The miners were paid upwards from 18 shillings, and that rather depended on the success that they had getting the ore out and what kind of bargain they had struck up with Macadam Cathcart. And the labourers were paid between 12 and 14 shillings, and the lead washers much less. We don't know very much about the deaths at the mines before 1855, because that was the year that the registration of deaths became compulsory. And it's a shame in a way, because the greatest activity at the mine was between 1840 and 1853. There was an occasional report of accidents in the local papers. Perhaps a miner fell down a shaft, or perhaps they were killed in a rockfall. In the 10 years after 1855, when far fewer people were living there, I counted 16 deaths being recorded, with the most common cause of death being pertussis, which is TB, tuberculosis. About 35 years ago, I took up some very active 8-year-olds to the mines to try and solve one of the mysteries that we have about it. We don't know where the dead were buried. There's a few that were buried in Carsphairn churchyard, but very few of the many people that must have died there. So when I took these old people up, I had hoped that when they got out of the car, they would all walk to the same place. They scattered completely. 2 of them had brought their spades with them, and when they got to the destination where they were certain that they would have found some graves, they started digging. They didn't find anything, and we really came to the conclusion that we could not know where the people were buried at all up there, but there must have been. There are 155 births there in the years between 1841 and 1881. As for the health of the inhabitants of the lead mines, we don't really know an awful lot. There were several gardens, and there is still evidence of lazy beds being there where the potatoes were planted. There's a couple of shops, and where the supplies came in from Darmellington. And we also know that there was water from 2 wells. One I mentioned earlier, the story of the old lady who fell down the well. One wonders what they did for leisure time. They didn't probably have all that much. Some were keen on education and others on sports. And I had mentioned earlier that the Wanlock Head and Lead Hills miners felt rather superior to the village people. And they had, but they did attempt to have harmonious relations. For instance, they played some quoits, and there was an occasion when the miners went down to the village to play quoits and lost the game. The miners were on their way back to the lead mines, trudging up through the village, when some of the village men started to taunt them. This developed into a full-scale fight between the miners and the villagers, which must have gone on for quite a while, because there is a record of the village women coming out to watch the fight, to see what was going on. Well, it got so bad that a miner was killed. When that happened, they went home very quietly. But I want to quote to you what the Procurator Fiscal said when he came to Carsphairn. And this came from an account that had been written at the time. And this is what he said. The conclusion by the Procurator Fiscal was that the miners and villagers should be separated as much as possible, and the tailor who was the murderer was bound over to keep the peace as regards all Her Majesty's subjects, and not to kill miners within a lesser space than 2 years. There was no further evidence of any relationship at all between the miners and the villagers. Education was pretty important. Colonel Cathcart had a school built in 1843. There are at least records of 3 teachers having lived there. By 1851, there were 49 children at the school, aged between 5 and 14. And there seems to be great praise for the school in the local press and from various other people. There was a competition held in the Glenkens by the Glenkens Society, which is a philanthropic society, which really held competitions for everything for one's well-being. And in the school's competition for the best handwriting in 1853, the prize for the best junior was won by William Doby from the Lead Mine School. And another former pupil, who was known as James Wilson, went on to Edinburgh University and ended up being the much-loved minister of the church in New Abbey on the Solway coast. There's the most magnificent stained glass window in memory of him, and he was obviously very highly respected by everybody there. But not only was the education of the children looked after, there was a library at the school. Now, this had over 1,000 volumes of titles that were pretty grim reading in some ways, but it was all for education. They were all factual books, and there were nearly 500 different titles there. Colonel Cathcart gave the occasional book. He gave a bound copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and he also gave occasional grants. And anyone who lived within 10 miles of the lead mines was allowed to borrow books. The Lead Miners' Library in Wanlockhead also lent books, but it is noted in the minutes of their society that they complained that the books were borrowed from Wanlockhead to Woodhead, and they weren't always returned. Although the church isn't on the site of the lead mine, it's an important part of the life there. It was built after the disruption of 1843, and after several meetings were to gauge the interest in it. Colonel Cathcart did not want a free church on his ground, and that's the reason why it was built a mile away at a more sympathetic landowner. There were 91 members of that church, and they were joined by people from the village, and I explained earlier that fairly soon, within 40 years, it became a sheep pen. So that makes me think, well, what was the impact of the mine? In the short term, it was pretty dramatic. This community built out of nothing on a bare, bleak, desolate hillside. They brought in people who were not farming. In the new statistical account of 1844, the minister wrote about the hustle and the bustle of the activity there, of the population doubling, of more coaches passing through the community, of people spending more money in the community, because some did take lodgings in the community, and that standards of education being raised. But that was short-lived, because by 1853, many miners had left, difficulties in mining the ore, and also in the price of lead slumping. And the population quickly declined from it being 301 in 1851 to just 75 in 1861. And for thereafter, it never recovered, and within years, the production of lead ore was completely stopped. By the 1900s, there were maybe 2 or 3 houses occupied on the site. It was quite often, it would be people who were self-employed, who couldn't get housing elsewhere. And really, until the 1950s, there might have been 1 or 2 houses occupied there, but nothing since then. And the impact in the long run, well, sheep are still grazing there, but in 1992, it was deemed to be an ancient monument. It became listed. So it's protected from any man-made interference, but it's not protected from the harsh climate. Remember, I said that it is quite high up. Over the years, I've visited it fairly regularly, and I've been witnessing an accelerating amount of decay. But this really shouldn't take away anything from that project, which was started with such high hopes, with such aspirations, and with very high standards. And I'm really glad now that there is such a renewed interest in it. Thank you.
Right, well, I want to follow on from Anna's talk and look at how the mine worked, how the lead was got out, how it was processed, and also to look at what survives today, what is the industrial archaeology of the Woodhead Lead Mine. And I thought we'd start by trying to put Woodhead into a broader context. This map, this slide, shows all the known mines in Dumfries and Galloway. And I think it makes the point that the area is very well served with mineral resources. Woodhead was just one of many, many mines. However, most of the mines on this slide, which probably date from the late 18th, early 19th century, were very small affairs developed by the local landowner to try and improve the economy of his estates. And the vast majority of these were completely unsuccessful. The exception, however, was Woodhead, which, as Anna has mentioned, under the management of Colonel Cathcart, became a moderately successful lead mine for quite a few years. And in the 1840s, when Woodhead was at its height, the only other sort of comparable large lead mines in Dumfries and Galloway were at Wanlock Head, way up in the north of the area, that's it, and then down in the south on the Cuckoobushire coast, a bit further down, there we go, around Newton Stewart, there were lead mines at Cairnsmore and Blackcraig and the Cree Valley. But really, Woodhead in the 1840s was one of this small number of pretty productive or locally productive lead mines. Now, we've seen this picture before, this absolutely superb view of the mine in the 1880s or the 1890s. We'll come back to it later on as well, but I just want to point out a few features to help us get a grounding when we're looking at the archaeology. You'll see centre left these huge tips above the buildings, and these were the waste tips from the main access level to the mine, the middle level. You'll notice above this standing gentleman's head, if you look carefully, between his hat and the houses, a timber structure. This was the main pumping engine on the principal shaft. And to the left of his hat, you'll see the water wheel that powered the crushing mill. The white low tips in front of that are the washing floors where the lead was processed, and the buildings in the foreground, as Anna said earlier, are the remains of the Smelt Mill and the Silver Refinery. Now, in 2004, Stranraer Museum got some grant aid from what was then Historic Scotland for a project known as the Galloway Metal Mines Project. And as part of that, we were able to bring in CFA Archaeology to survey and record a number of lead mines in Galloway to try and get some idea of the state of survival. And one of these, of course, was Woodhead. And this is the basic plan that CFA Archaeology produced. And with a plan like this, it's very easy to try and get some handle on how the mine operated. So, for instance, in the next slide, we can see here highlighted the houses that Anna was talking about earlier. Over to the left, most of the buildings there, the main housing blocks, are above the mine, looking down the valley onto it. The exception is down there, bottom right, where you can see a small number of buildings, the Mill Row, which were opposite the smelter and housed the smelting workforce. Very similar slides here to the ones that Anna showed. Just like to make 2 points. The slide on the left, which shows the miners' housing at Higher and Low Row, if you look carefully in the foreground in front of the building, you can see some corrugated ground, and that's the remains of the lazy beds, the little vegetable plots which the miners and their families had. The other point I'd like to make is that although we talk about Woodhead as being a fairly unique Scottish ghost town, it wasn't the only planned mining village in Dumfries and Galloway. As early as the 1760s, there was a planned village at Craigton for the Black Craig lead mines near Newton Stewart. Some 10 years later, over at Jamestown, there was a little village for the Louisa Antimony mine. This was near Westerkirk by Langham. And into the early 1800s, the Duke of Buccleuch built another planned village for his coal mining workforce at Rowan near Canonby. And that one, of course, is still lived in today, for those of you who know that part of southwest Scotland. And Dumfries and Galloway actually has a fascinating and almost quite unique within Scotland collection of planned villages, not just for mining, but for fishing and for textile and for quarrying. The one thing that couldn't be recorded in 2004 was the main part of the mine, the underground workings. These are pretty much inaccessible. But we do have some idea of what was happening there with plans like this, undated but probably certainly read when the mine was working. The centre part of this plan is, if you like, a sort of horizontal view of this maze of workings, the horizontal tunnels or levels that were driven through the mine. And the mine was actually working two veins of lead, the Woodhead vein and the Garryhorn vein, that ran parallel to each other. And these essentially were vertical fissures full of lead and other waste minerals. The two images, top left and at the bottom, are sections of the mine working. And it shows you how the mine was developed by driving these vertical tunnels or levels into horizontal tunnels or levels and vertical shafts. And if you look carefully at that pencil mark on the top left-hand drawing, you can see that the bottom level was called a 25 fathom level. Interestingly, most mines, their depth was measured in fathoms. 25 fathom, 150 feet, 45 metres, gives you some idea of the depth of the workings. And those grey shaded parts were where the vein had been worked out in a series of chambers known as stopes. And with the levels, the middle level in blue, called the low level, was the drainage level, and the one above that in pink, the middle adit level, was the main haulage level out of the mine. And here we just try to sketch very simply the extent of those workings onto the plan. And you can see how scattered across the site are a whole series of shafts marked here as red circles. And note, if you will, too, the middle level in the centre, which was the haulage or access level from the mine out to the dressing floors, and down bottom right, the adit or drainage level. And in the centre there, Harvey's shaft was the main pumping shaft at the mine. We'll mention that again in a minute. In terms of the archaeology, fairly substantial open cast workings at the very top of the mine. These may well have been where the mine first began in the 1830s and 1840s, where the lead was discovered. But very soon they began working deeper through a series of shafts. And many of those shafts, as Anna said earlier, are marked by these quite spectacular Rowan trees, possibly planted by the miners. And one of the other sort of reminders of the underground work, again, is a site that Anna mentioned, the powder house or magazine, where the gunpowder was kept for the miners to take underground. High explosives didn't come in until the 1870s or later, so all the mining used black powder, gunpowder, for developing the underground part of the mine. So I mentioned this pumping shaft, Harvey's shaft, and in that blow-up of the photograph, you can, with the eye of faith, see some sort of structure there for pumping the mine. We don't know what this mechanism was. There's just one single reference that says, the beautiful balance machine, first invented by Brindley. We don't know what that balance machine looked like. We don't know who Brindley was, certainly not in a Scottish context. The chances are it looked a bit like that preserved beam engine you can still see today at Wanlock Head, where water coming in from a lathe filled a huge bucket. The weight of the water lifted the pump rods up from the shaft, helped to drain the water out. The bucket then emptied, and the weight of the rods went back down the shaft. And so this combination of water filling and emptying helped to work the machine that was pumping the mine. It would be great to do some more research on what this machine was like and who Brindley was. So when the material came out of the mine, it had to be crushed and dressed. And a huge area in the central part of the site is the remains of the crushing and what's called the dressing floor. Now here's a blow-up of part of the first detailed plan of the mine, the Ordnance Survey 6-inch map from 1853. And if you can see just right of centre, I've marked with an arrow the level, the middle level, where all the material came out to be taken to the dressing floors. And you can see that just below that, the map actually marks crushing machine, the site of the ore crusher. Now I've also highlighted on this in blue part of this myriad of lathes, watercourses, that brought water to the mine, because all the machinery was worked by water and water alone. I think you can see again just below the crushing machine, it marks a thing called Weaver's Dam, and that dam still survives today as a fairly sort of major feature, and water from there was taken to work the crushing machine, to work the washing floors, and also to work the smelt mill. Now the crushing machine, we've got, again, when you blow up that photograph, you can see it in quite some detail, but we only have one contemporary reference which says the wheel used for moving the crushing apparatus is about 30 feet in diameter, driven by water obtained from the neighbouring mountains. Again, we know no more. The survey we did in 2004 shows some quite interesting but enigmatic bits of stonework around there. It will be very interesting to do some more detailed survey. But I think that what this machine was an ore crusher. This Victorian drawing on the right-hand side shows a section of one, and essentially it was like a giant water-powered mangle. Ore was poured down through a hopper. Below the hopper, you can just see these two little circles. These were massive cast iron rollers. These worked against each other and crunched the ore down to a fairly fine gravel. Once you'd done that, the next part of the process was to separate the lead and the waste in that gravel that came out of the crusher. The dressing, or the crushing and dressing floors, as Anna said earlier, most of the material was taken away in the 1960s for road material. But again, there are still hints of what may have been there. There's still buried archaeology and some great potential for further work. Again, we only have hints as to how the washing floor worked. One reference that says the ore is conveyed to the washing sieves, shaken by overshot wheels. So the machinery is water powered. It may well have been like this thing we can see on the left-hand side, a mechanical jig, where the waste material, the waste and lead, was put in this sieve box. The box went up and down in water, and by a process of gravity separation, the waste came to the top, the heavier lead settled at the bottom, and the two could be separated. The second Ordnance Survey map from the 1890s shows a series of circular features in this part of the site. These may well have been things called circular buddles. There's an example of one here at Wenlock Head that was built at the same time in the 1840s. So again, great archaeological potential here. The final part of the site is the Smelt Mill, which is, Anna said, is one of the best preserved in Scotland, and certainly it's only one of two surviving from the 19th century, the other being the Meadowfoot smelter at Wenlock Head. Here's a general view. You can see the chimneys at the top, the two chimneys, the flues coming down, and this pile of rubble is the main ore hearth building. So again, in a bit more detail, that photograph from the 1880s shows the buildings very, very well. And we can compare that with part of the 2004 survey. And we know again from one contemporary account, there was a 24-foot wheel here, water wheel, that worked two hearths. Now, probably one of those was an ore hearth, where the lead was smelted. The second hearth was a slag hearth. The slag was a waste from the smelting process that was reworked in the slag hearth to get any extra lead out of it. The building that you can see in the centre of the photograph, which is a building centre left on the plan, may have been roasting hearths, where the ore before it was smelted was roasted to reduce the weight of water and to get rid of any sulfide contamination. And the building at the bottom, which is the one we can see on the far left of the photograph with the tall chimney, was the Silver Refinery. In 1851, a record says that for every ton of lead, they were getting 18 ounces of silver. And if we know that certainly in the 1840s, the average annual tonnage was around 900 tons, at 18 ounces per ton, that's not a bad amount of silver coming out of this mine. And we do know that the Colonel's wife, Colonel Cathcart's wife, used some of the silver from Woodhead to make some communion cups for the local church. Whether those survive, I don't know. Maybe Anna knows more about that. To give us an idea of how the ore hearths may have looked in detail, if you go to Wenlock Head, some slightly earlier examples there have been excavated and restored, very much like a blacksmith's hearth, with bellows at the back, blown by water wheel. It could be that our example at Woodhead was actually worked by blowing cylinders. And this oil painting on the right-hand side shows some of those hearths actually at work in the 1780s at Lead Hills. And finally, the flues coming up the chimneys. Again, very well preserved. The chimney is still standing, or one is, but as you can see, it's been pretty well knocked around over the years. One of the things we did in the 2004 survey was produce some quite detailed profile drawings of both chimneys, and you can see those bottom left. And if nothing else, those give us a snapshot of the condition of that part of the monument some 16 years ago. We can use that to compare with how the site looks now. But as Anna said at the very end of her part of the talk, these sites are deteriorating quite quickly. It's hard to know what you can do, certainly with things like the chimney. Probably time will just take its toll. All we can do is record. But I would say, looking at these archaeologically, although we've lost a lot, there's still a lot that remains there. As I said earlier, huge potential to investigate what may have been the pumping machine, what may survive on the dressing floors, and most importantly, I think, a new, very detailed survey of the smelting mill and refining mills could tell us a huge amount about how lead and silver were processed at this mine, and also tell us a lot about lead and silver processing in Victorian Scotland. Okay, thank you.
There we go. Well, I just thought that was fascinating. Thank you so much. Really interesting, and a really nice balance of the social history and the workings of the lead mine. Struck me as a different world, isn't it? Where when you kill somebody, then they tell you not to kill someone else for another 2 years. That's a whole different world. And when we were looking at the black powder, I think both of you referenced that. I'm just going to unmute you. I think, Anna, did you make reference to the fact there aren't many death records? And I was wondering if we had any way, that black powder sounds dangerous.
It certainly would have been dangerous, but because it wasn't compulsory to register deaths before 1855, we only know of those who were in the churchyard and occasional references in the local papers.
Yeah.
I would very much like to know more, but I've drawn a blank so far.
Yeah, and that's right. That was right at the end of the period, of the active period, wasn't it, 1853. Somebody asked a question to me saying that they thought that maybe the lead was the byproduct of a silver mine initially. Now, you did touch on that, John. But which was the byproduct, and which was the
byproduct was very much the silver.
Right.
Lead was absolutely the main product, and the silver was a byproduct through refining of that.
Yeah, and not enough to keep it going, clearly.
No.
Right. So I think as well, John, you mentioned Brindley, James Brindley, and not knowing if who that was exactly. And there was a little bit of internal discussion on the chat, which was brilliant, about was it the James Brindley of canal fame? But of course, he died in 1772.
He did. So he's much earlier. However, he did develop some very interesting pumping machines for a colliery near Salford at the time. So he's got a record of being involved in pumping machinery. Whether his invention would still have been sort of around in the 1830s, 1840s is harder to believe. But certainly it's an area we need to look at. We don't know anything about the Brindley that's mentioned here. And James Brindley is certainly a possibility, or something that he had first developed.
Yeah, fascinating. Suzanne's just saying, very interesting, not a question as such, but she's saying, I've traced our family for 6 generations as they've moved from tin mining in Cornwall to iron in Dalton-in-Furness and then coal in Bishop Auckland. So that's another insight into how things might have looked, and also that why people were forced to move on. For me, it was really striking, Anna, when you were talking about the tiny time scale, well within a working life. And you've moved your family and then you're off again, quite dramatic. A question from Colin: were they on-site shops company stores? By which I assume he means that the money had to stay circulating and you were trapped.
I don't have any evidence to say that they were. I believe that in other mining areas that they were company shops, but I have never come across the evidence that it was in Woodhead. So maybe it was.
Certainly at Wenlock Head, there was a large shop that was run by the Duke of Buccleuch and was very, very unpopular.
A question from Ian: how was the lead transported away in that time? Was it pack horse or wagons? Do we know?
Well, there was a very big stable up at the lead mine, so I imagine it was obviously horses, wagons, I would have thought.
Very interesting. And somebody was actually asking if it's still accessible by car, and I think it is, isn't it? How close can you get?
Well, it is on the farm of Gary Horn. It's not a good road. It's a private road up from the nearby bridge, but it's not really accessible unless you've got a four-wheel drive.
Okay. And if you wanted to walk in from the bridge, what are you talking then? An hour?
About a mile. About a mile.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah, it's quite accessible.
We know that in Dalmellington, Cathcart kept a thing called the lead yard. So all the lead was transported initially to Dalmellington. And once it had built up enough there, it was then transported on to Ayr and then taken by sea to Liverpool or London to the markets.
Ah, fantastic. Anne's wondering, was there any evidence of the arts? You were speaking, Anne, about what they did with their limited leisure time. Education and sports very important to them. Any evidence of kind of visual arts?
None whatsoever that I have come across. I doubt that any of the books they read were about art. In fact, I'm sure they weren't. I would have noticed it in the catalogue that we have got. No, I don't think so.
No, okay. I guess it's maybe thing when you've got a little bit more time to do. A question, having just mentioned LiDAR there, 3D Galloway, would LiDAR help to locate possible grave sites? However, is it the overgrownness, or is it the fact that they've just sunk, do you think?
Well, I don't know very much about LiDAR. I noticed this year when we were up, it had been a particularly wet summer, so there's an immense amount of bracken and foliage. So I really don't know. I have been up there in very dry periods, and the ground cover is very sparse because there's not an awful lot of soil there. I think someone who knows more about LiDAR should be better qualified to answer that question than I am.
Well, we'll put that to Dave in a couple of months' time.
When the survey was done in 2004, of course, LiDAR didn't exist. And to have good LiDAR coverage for the site would be absolutely fascinating. And I don't know about the graves, but certainly for the rest of the site and trying to interpret it, it would be a very, very useful tool.
Ah, lovely. People are also asking about aerial photography, and I suppose the same, you probably didn't have drones then, John. Yeah, some drone footage after a dry summer.
It was only 14 years ago, but it was state-of-the-art technology.
Yeah, it's crazy, isn't it? How time goes on. Yeah, people are a fan of the LiDAR. What other survey tools would you use? So on those lines, John, how much the technology's moved on. If you were doing it now, what would you do?
Well, having said, I mean, LiDAR and drones can give us a very good idea about the overall site. But I think to really further our understanding, we need detailed survey of certain parts of the site. And when you're doing that, in many ways, you can forget all that posh stuff. You can go down to some very simple, old-fashioned tape measure survey, ideal for community groups. Community groups doing plain table survey, and I think doing some detailed surveys, as I said earlier, the Smelt Mill, some standing building surveys, would produce huge results, incredibly beneficial, and very simple and cheap to do.
Yeah. Our volunteers were doing some plain table surveys, learning about that last summer, weren't they, Claire? So, yeah, fascinating. Lovely. Any sign of Roman mining activity? If this is out with your area of expertise, just say so.
Romans are almost completely absent in terms of mining from anywhere in southwest Scotland.
No.
No. There are hints of prehistoric copper mining on the coast.
Yeah.
But that's about
nothing else.
Romans seem to have completely ignored Scotland's mineral resources.
Get it away. I'm slightly nervous about asking this because we can't be encouraging people to be poking around a scheduled monument, but is there any access, or has there historically been access to the underground workings?
There is no access now, no.
No, just above ground. Yeah, that makes sense. Do we know, you mentioned the library, Anna, do we know what happened to the books in the library, particularly the ones they'd stolen from One Lock Head?
I really have no idea. I would love to spend time in the One Lock Head library looking through all the pages of them, or to seeing if there's any reference to Woodhead. I only know of one book that has Woodhead Library written in it, and it's a hymn book.
Oh.
That's all I know.
So we just don't know where the library went?
No. No, whether it went back to the Cathcart family, I have no idea. I would perhaps think that some went back to One Lock Head.
Mm. Oh, well, I mean, because that must have been an amazing resource for its time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Just following up on the art, actually, any sign of rock carving? Did the children mess around? Nothing that you've not seen anything like that? No. Oh, lovely. And we've got a question here from a young person. Anna, any thoughts on what type of lessons the children would have had? Would they be learning about health and well-being like our guys do?
Unlikely, I would think. Going back to that Galloway, the Glen Kent Society that I mentioned earlier on, there were lots of the handwriting examples often were during the Crimean War was words from the Crimean War. So there was Constantinople had to be used as a word. So presumably there was some history teaching, but apart from that, I have no idea.
Yeah, it's fascinating to imagine, isn't it? Yeah, because then I guess most of them would have been expected just to turn 2 at the age of 14 and start work. Did the Crown claim ownership or tax the silver? Do we know?
I don't know.
I don't know.
They certainly didn't. I mean, not the lead. I can find out and get back to you.
There we go. That's a good offer, Jim. Is it reputed to be haunted? Any tales? Ghostly tales?
The lead mine itself is not reputed to be haunted, but the road going up to the lead mine from the Garryhorn side or from the Carsphairn village side, there are stories about a row of trees where certainly there were witches appeared in the 1850s.
Oh, and Ellie and anyone else, if you're interested in that, our penultimate event it'll be in late November. I can't remember the date offhand, but is a romp through the paranormal of the Galloway with mostly ghostly. So if you fancy a bit of hearing about the other side of our heritage, then I think that'll be a great event. There seems to be a monument located about 1 kilometre due north from the Chimneys. Do you know anything about that, says Donald?
The only monument that I can tell you about is that to a gentleman called David McMath, who was the son of a lead miner, probably the grandson of a lead miner. He was walking back to the lead mines in 1925 in a terrible snowstorm. He'd been weakened by an appendicitis operation about 6 weeks beforehand. He got off the bus about a mile north of the village and tried to get home because his old father was still living at the lead mine, and he sat down by a stone wall, the dike, to have a rest, and he died there. And that cairn was erected by the community in memory of him.
Gosh, wow, that's all the stories behind these little markings on the maps. It's amazing. Do we know where the Free Church was located? It wasn't on the land, but do we know exactly where it was?
Yes, the remains of it are still there. It is on the farmland of Lamloch, about a mile nearer down Mellington, off the main road.
Okay, and is that maybe marked as a ruin nowadays, do you think?
I'm not sure whether it is marked.
Yeah.
It's very little of it to see nowadays.
Okay, one to look out for. Lovely. Somebody managed to get underground before it was sealed. Braver person than I am. Oh, that's interesting. Were there any other significant minerals along with the lead and silver? There were a lot. You showed us that map, John, of all the different sorts of mines, but witherite and barytes?
No, as far as we know, the only workable mineral was the lead, and then the silver that was in that. However, whilst Woodhead itself is only lead with silver, if you go a little bit further up onto the hills, there's quite an interesting deposit of iron that was mined in the later 19th century by the Dalmellington Iron Company, but they never actually got it down to the furnaces, so all the iron is still lying at the site of the open cast workings.
And then
that's about a mile from Woodhead.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, last call for Stephen's commented that zinc was present but had little value at the time. Another reminder that things go up and down in value through the time. Here we go. Oh yes, and actually that's reminded me, Peter, that I missed a previous question. What are the toxicity levels in the soils like these days? And somebody else did ask whether the soil was tested for pollution in the 60s.
I have never known of it being tested, but I could well be wrong. I really don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, nothing in your mind about when after they removed the slag or anything. Are there any restrictions on farming in the area? Oh, go on, John, sorry.
It's interesting that the lazy beds, the miners' gardens, were all above the mine, so none of the waste coming out would be affecting it. And hopefully when the wind was blowing in the right direction, mostly the fumes were taken away from the gardens as well.
Yeah.
Well, having said that, there were, I think, Anna, some lazy beds down by Mill Row and the smelters' cottages?
Yes, yeah, there
Would have
were.
been more open to pollution at the time.
Yes, they could have been. Mm-hmm.
They did know what they were doing, didn't they? But then it's the long-term effects as well. I don't see any restrictions on farming around there. It's all available for grazing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Sue's asking, who, if anyone, do we need to ask for permission to drive up to it?
You need to ask the landowner.
But can you park near the bridge and walk? Is that?
Yes, you can park fairly close and walk up. It's not a hard walk because it's all on road surface.
Okay, lovely. Ian was again speculating that it might have been investigated later for zinc. And there was a gold rush, wasn't there, in the Carsphairn Hills at one point, but I don't know if that came to anything. Oh, here we go. Alison's saying that my granny kept hens here when she lived in the 1920s and 30s, and the hens did not thrive. And she thought that was because the poisoning. Yeah, well, fascinating. I think we'll close it there. Thank you so much to Anna and John. I think that was absolutely fascinating. What a wealth of experience you have got between you. And speaking for myself, I'm delighted that we've got it recorded and it's there for posterity now. So thank you all very much.